Yeah, if you ever can't make it, I usually forget to record, but if you can't make it and you want me to record it, I'm happy to do that. Uh, any questions people have?
I have a question.
Yeah.
It has to do with preparing, well, more about separating for on Shabbat, and the time between. So what defines immediately before you eat? Is it
That's a good question. So that's a very good question. Yeah. So, I mean, I would say if you're preparing the meal, that's before, that's immediately before. Now, the question, I guess, in people's minds would be, let's say it's Shabbat morning. Now, so let me step back. What's boger? So boger is separating. So separating is a problem. It's one of the 39 milachot, one of the 39 labors, because in the process of making bread in the building of the tabernacle or in the functioning of the tabernacle, they would grow wheat and then you'd have to winnow the wheat. In other words, to separate the chaff from the wheat. You do that by throwing it, you bang it on the ground, you throw it up in the air, and then the wind blows away the chaff. So you're taking away the bad from the good, and you're doing it in the fields. So we have an idea that, so if you're not doing it in that way, it would be rabbinic. And if you're doing it in a way that's what's called derech achila, the way of eating, peeling the rind off of an orange, that's how you eat an orange. So that's not called winnowing. That's not called separating, borer. So if you do it in with three criteria, you don't use a special tool for it. You do it right before you're going to eat it. In other words, it's part of the eating. Derech achila, it's the way of eating. It's not something that you're doing far in advance, like in a field. And you do it not the way it's done in the field, which is taking the bad away from the good, but you take the good from the bad. You remove what you want. How do you define the good and the bad? That's what you want and what you don't want. So you take what you want away from what you don't want. That's considered very different than the process in the field. And you're doing it right before you eat. So it's part of the eating process. It's the way of eating. So Kate's question is, what do you mean? How close does it have to be? What if I want to do it Friday night for a meal on Shabbat day? Is that called right before? I mean, I am preparing that meal. So I would say that's not, because definitely before the Friday night meal, it's not. In other words, if it's before a different meal, I would say it's not. So what if it's in the morning, let's say before I go to shul, or even if it's at night after I eat my nighttime meal? What's called the process? So you could imagine that it would be part of whenever you're preparing the meal. Well, let's actually take a look at the halacha and see if we can find a definition. Let's see if sometimes you can find a source and it will quote another source. So it says here, one of the criteria for separating for Shabbat is la'alter. La'alter means immediately. A muter liver machal suda shiatchel amnam ba'od zman katzar. Can I prepare for a meal that's going to begin in a little bit of time? Because they're asking here if you could do it before the meal, but it's for dessert. So they quote here the Mishnah Berurah. So let's look at the Mishnah Berurah. Siman Shinya Tes, Sif Aleph, Sif Pat Dalet. So this is the laws of Shabbat. This is the Shulchan Aruch. Shinya Tes. Let's take a look at it in Sefaria. So Shin Yud Tes is 319. So I'm going to click Halacha, Shulchan Aruch. Orach Chaim Shulchan Aruch has 4 sections. Orach Chaim, which means the way of life, daily ritual observance. Yoredeya, which is these things, ritual slaughter, kashrut, conversion. Even Ho'ezer, which is family law, marriage, divorce. Choshen Mishpat, which is torts, damages, financial disputes. This is business law. So these are the 4 sections of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch did not include everything. Shulchan Aruch only included the things that are relevant today. The Maimonides, the Rambam, in his Mishnah Torah, it's another book of Jewish law, the Mishnah Torah, he included everything: the temple, the purity and impurity. But that's not true of the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch is in the 1500s by Rabbi Yosef Cairo. It was preceded by the Tur, his teacher, a century before. So we're going to click on Orach Chaim. The laws of Shabbat is in in fact, the earlier version of the Shulchan Aruch in the 14th century was called the Tur. Tur means a row, and it was actually called the Arba Turim, the 4 rows. And the phrase comes from the breastplate on the high priest. It had 3 stones by 4 stones, so it had 4 rows. So it's called 4 rows because it has 4 different sections of Jewish law. And then the Shulchan Aruch was a later version of the Tur, and it has these 4 sections. So Shabbat is going to be an Orach Chaim, which means the way of life in Hebrew. And we said it was Shin Yud Tet, which is 319. So this will be the laws in the Shulchan Aruch of Borer. Let's see if they have it in English. That would be good for everybody. They do. All right. You never know. One who sorts food from refuse. If there were 2 types of food placed in front of him, he sorts one from the other with the aid of a sifter or strainer, he's liable. With a cone or a dish, he's patur, right? Again, this is the usual thing, a special tool for it, but you could use something that's just a general tool. But it is forbidden to do so. If he sorts it with his hand, in order to eat immediately, it's permitted. So even a tool that is a semi-specialized tool that you can't use, but you can use your hand. I think you'll probably use a spoon also, we'll see. And if you do it right before it's used immediately, that's permitted. The Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis was an Ashkenazi. Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who writes the Shulchan Aruch, is a Sephardi. He lives in the early 1500s, late 14, early 1500s. And the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, is an Ashkenazic Jew who lives in Eastern Europe just after, not long after Rabbi Yosef Cairo. And he adds usually the Ashkenazic position. So he wants to define it further. Whatever one separates for a meal he's about to eat is called for immediate use, right? What's Rabbi Yosef? What's the Ramah? Rabbi Moshe is bothered by? He's bothered by your question, right? By Kate's question, which is, the Shulchan Aruch had said to eat it immediately. So the question is, what's immediately? I have to go like this and then eat it? So the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe says it means if you're doing it for the meal that you're going to be eating. Now, if right now you're preparing for meal X, that's called immediately. You're preparing for that meal. It could be 2 minutes before, it could be an hour before. You're right. It depends how long it takes to prepare the meal. It sounds like from this, if I did it Friday night, even though it's after 8, the Friday night meal, that would not be immediate use. Immediate use would have to be, now let's say before shul, I'm going to make I'm going to do some preparation. And after shul, I'm going to do some other preparation. Are both of those called la'alter? Are both of those called immediately? So let's see. Quotes several sources for this law that it means when you're preparing for that meal. Even if other people are eating with him, that's okay. He gives an example. He says, therefore, it's permitted to separate the good leaves of a vegetable called lettuce from the moldy ones if you require it for the upcoming meal. Okay. The next halach is, this is the Shulchan Aruch again, Rabbi Yosef Kara. Borer ochel mitoch ptolet, one who sorts food from waste, in other words, the stuff you want, the good from the bad, with your hands. So you got 2 of the criteria. Lahanicho, but to put it aside, not to eat it right away. Afilu lebo bayom, even for that day, that is as if you've separated it for a storage facility, as if you're storing it, and that's too much like doing it in the field, v'chayev, and that's not permitted. You would be obligated. You would be guilty. So what does it mean by that? What's called later use? That day. So again, we haven't really answered it. Okay, so let's see the commentaries on these two paragraphs. So the easiest commentary to look at, most straightforward, is the Mishnah Berurah. This is the Chafetz Chaim. Oh wait, did I share my screen with you? No, I didn't. I'm so sorry. I was under the impression I'd shared my screen. I'm like acting as if I shared my screen, but I didn't. I'm so sorry. Okay. So, okay. So I was looking here. I went from, let me show you how I got here. I'm so sorry. I pulled up Safari, yeah? You can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, and I clicked on, put this in English. I clicked on halacha, law. Now remember I mentioned the Tur, which was the earlier form of the Shulchan Aruch. And here's the Shulchan Aruch, Code of Jewish Law, written by Rabbi Yosef Karo, 16th century. And it has 4 sections: Orach Chaim, daily observance; Yeridea, ritual slaughter, and other things; Even Ezer, family law; Choshen Mishpat, business law. So I clicked on Orach Chaim. This is the daily laws, and it includes Shabbat. And I knew from Googling it that it was 319 Shinei Tet. And then I had found, this is what I had just read you, that one who sorts food from what they don't want, you have to do it with your hand, and you have to do it for right away, and you have to take the good from the bad. And the question was, what do we mean right away? So the Ramar, Moshe Isserles, had said, it means if you're preparing for the upcoming meal, that's called right away. But then the next halacha was, if you separate the good from the bad, even if you do it with your hands, but you do it to put it aside for a later meal, for later, even later that day, that's not permitted, because that's too much like a storage house. That's too much like doing it in the field. So let's look at the commentaries here. So I was saying that the commentary of the Mishnah Berurah is very good to begin with. Sometimes a little bit strict, but he is very straightforward. Unfortunately, it's only in Hebrew. And kind of lays things out for you. He says to eat it right away. What is it? But again, what does it mean right away? Can I do it before shul? That's like the real question, right?
Rabbi, what is chayav?
Obligated or guilty. It really means obligated. Chayav can mean I'm chayav in a mitzvah. I'm obligated to do a mitzvah. But it can also mean chayav, you're obligated, meaning like you're guilty. You've done something wrong. So he says here that even if the meal is very long, let's say you're doing it right before the meal, it's for dessert, that's okay. Okay, let's see the next one. So he says for the third meal on Shabbat, there's a certain instance they used to eat betzel onions in vinegar. And they would have to do some separating. So they should only do that right before the meal. Right, so he doesn't really answer it. Let's look in, I often tell you to look in the Penina Halacha. So let's look in the Penina Halacha, because that's also in English. Here we go, right? Boom. All I did was Google Penina Halacha separating Shabbat, and I got Boer. That's good, right? He's in English. Here we go. It gives you a lot of detail. There's 4 different kinds of work involved with Boer: winnowing, threshing, sifting. And here, if we click on this immediate, right, he's got each paragraph here is listed by title. Here's immediate use. Very easy to use, right? As we saw, section 2. Prohibition of Boer only applies when it's done through derech malacha. If it's done through the way of work, the way of the way that the work was done in the Torah, which was separate. But if you separate the good from the bad, what you want to eat from what you don't want to eat, in order to eat it immediately, that's not called boer. Since that is derech achila. It's interesting, they throw it, even though it's English, they throw in a lot of Hebrew words in transliteration. It's a little hard. Derech achila means the way of eating. It's the process you eat, doing it in the process of eating. That's very distant from the process of the storehouse, which was sifting in the field. Therefore, one who wants to shell nuts for his family and serve them immediately may do so. But if he intends to serve them later, it's prohibited by Torah law, because that's derech malacha. That is the way that it's done in the field. Similarly, if anyone has a mixture of watermelon seeds and sunflower seeds, which to eat only the sunflower seeds, he cannot remove sunflower seeds to eat later on. If he does, he's transfer prohibition of boer. However, if he wishes to eat them immediately, he could do that. One who's preparing, so what, again, we still don't know what immediately is. One who is preparing a meal may separate enough food for the entire household, including guests. For example, if things aren't mixed together, serve just the almonds. If you take out the almonds, put them on a serving bowl before the meal in order to serve them at the end of the meal, right? So it doesn't have to be in the middle of the meal. It could be before the meal. Even if the meal lasts for 3 hours, and separation, this is what we saw in the Mishnah Berurah, that even if it's going to be for the end of the meal, you're doing it before the meal, it's all one meal. That's permitted. The key is that ochel must be removed. So now he gets into a kind of definition. Shortly before the meal. What does that mean, right? He's bothered, right? And as you get down in history, that could be that 500 years earlier, it doesn't explain the details because everybody knew what it meant. That's one possibility, right? But as you get down in history, it's less and less clear, and that's why you're asking your question. So he makes it clear. He says during the normal preparation time for the meal. However, if he does so prior to the normal preparation time, transgresses the prohibition of boer. The precise definition, right? So he understands what your issue is. Precise definition of the normal preparation time is why I like the Penina Halacha. It's very clear. Depends on the number of people and size of the meal. A meal for 5 demands less preparation time. A meal for 30. A meal with 1 course demands less preparation time for 3-course meal. It does not know exactly when the meal will begin. One may separate the ochel for the meal from the pasolet. Ochel means what you want, the part you're going to eat, from the pasolet, what you don't want, a little early in order to ensure the meal begins on time. In other words, it's for the meal, but you're worried. You don't want to wait so long, but you're still preparing for the meal, so that's okay. However, when you take care not to do it earlier than necessary to ensure the meal will be ready on time. Right? So it's still a little bit unclear. If you made more than you needed, but you didn't realize, that's okay. As long as you didn't try and cheat. So where does he get it from? Let's see, number 6. This is implied by the Ramah in the Mishnah Berurah. That's what we just read. There's a lot of different commentaries. The Ben Ish Chai is lenient and permits boer up to an hour before a meal. That's interesting. Okay, now we have a time. That's new. One who separates ochel from psolet in order to eat it later transgresses our prohibition, even if he ends up eating it immediately. According to the Ben Ish Chai, if one separated food with the intention of eating it immediately, then changed his mind, he's transgressed rabbinic prohibition. Circumstances beyond control, stop them from eating it immediately, that's okay. If one has a mixture of good and rotten fruit, someone's prepared a bowl of fruit for his guests, you separate the whole bowl, even though they're not going to eat it all, because that's the way you serve fruit. So that's interesting. Somebody gives a time, right? The Ben Ish Chai, who was a Sephardic rabbi, he's the first person to throw in a time, which was an hour. Hour before a meal. So, but on the other hand, what if you're preparing a meal? It's going to take you 2 hours to prepare the meal. You could do it 2 hours before because it's part of the preparation time. Because I think that's the idea that this is the preparation. Whenever you are preparing the meal, that's when you do it. So I would say, so I guess the question really in the end of it, if you came home from shul, Friday night it's a little bit less relevant because probably a lot of it you prepared before Shabbat. Now, even if Shabbat just began and it's going to be Friday night dinner, you're preparing for dinner, so you could do that. Let's say it's daytime. So let's say shul begins at 9 and you're going to get home at 12:30. Now, there's a couple options here, right? One option is when you get home, let's say you're going to make a salad. And part of the salad is going to involve separating the ochel from the separating. So if that's when you want to prepare the meal, when you get home from shul, because you don't want to do it at 8 a.m., you're tired. So obviously that's the time of preparing the meal. That works very well because that's right before the meal. And that's definitely the time of preparing the meal. That's what you're doing. Question would be, let's say that I don't want to take the time when I get home from shul to prepare this meal. I want to prepare the meal at 7 a.m. or 8 a.m. Maybe I even want to do it Friday night before I go to sleep because I want to go to shul, I want to come home, and then we're going to eat right away. Would that be permitted? That would be the question. So what do you think from what we have learned?
So on Friday night, if you don't eat anything until this meal that you're separating something for, that would be an upcoming meal.
In other words, let's say you ate your Friday night meal. Now it's 10 p.m. You're having people over for lunch during the daytime. So there's 3 options of when to get ready, right? And let's say you want to make a salad, and that's going to involve some separating. By the way, sometimes you could separate in a way that would be permitted, even if it's in advance, by taking some of the bad, some of the good, by not just separating the good from the bad, but taking some of the bad with it. You're not actually separating that well, but that's a separate question. But let's say that's going to involve some separating. Let's say you are going to have to, like the example that the Shulchan Aruch gave, you have lettuce, and some leaves you're going to want, some leaves you're not going to want. Some are better than others. So, or better example.
I think it's a no-go Friday night, right?
I would tend to agree with you. Now, the question, I guess, would be, what if you said to yourself, I'm doing all of my preparation Friday night for my Shabbat day meal because I want to get up, go to shul, come home and eat. So would that be permitted?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the reason I'm leaning towards no-go is that second paragraph that you're displaying, like that you should be careful not to do it too much before the meal.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. In other words, even if it's for a meal, remember the language that the Shulchan Aruch used? If it's for the otzer, for the storehouse. Now, you are storing this for the next day. You wouldn't say this is this is preparation for the. It is preparation for the meal, but it's not part. It's not really. It's not like I'm getting ready to eat. I'm not getting ready to eat. I'm gonna eat tomorrow. I'm gonna eat during the day tomorrow. I would tend to agree with you. I think Friday night, if it involves borer, I don't think you should do it.
But what if you're hosting like a huge simcha on Shabbat afternoon and you're going to shul for it, or like you're going to shul and then you're hosting a ton of people after? Wouldn't Friday night make sense?
You're right after shul, and if you try to do it in the morning,
I guess
You
you
wanna
could
come.
get up early. Yeah, but it wouldn't be enough.
right? There definitely wouldn't be time right after shul. So in that case, maybe this is the time of preparing for the meal. Maybe Friday night is the time for preparing for the meal. You're right. In other words, it's not like the normal, because if you're having a lot of people, so the normal time for preparing for this meal would be Friday night at 10 o'clock. That's what you're saying.
Now, with the example that Sophie raised, like I was thinking in my own head about, all right, is it better to, I'm speaking from the position of a woman, is it better to say, oh, I miss shul and do the preparations at home, or I do the preparations the night before if I'm hosting, as Sophie was saying, a large group?
Well, but there has to be an answer that applies to both genders. In other words, you could have a man in this situation also.
Yeah.
Where
So is it like, which one when you have sort of competing needs like that, what do you do?
Right. So I think we need another source or two. I don't feel like I really have a sense of the answer. So let's look up some more halacha. Let's take a look at the Be'er Heitev. I guess this is why you call the rabbi. This is what I would do if you called me. La'alter. So the Be'er Heitev. Who is the Be'er Heitev? Let's see what Be'er Heitev is. No, wait, we don't know who it is. Very nice. They give you about this text. Be'er Heitev Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim. The author is Yehuda ben Shimon Ashkenazi. A short summary, the made relevant commentaries, composed in 1705 in Amsterdam. All right, why did I pull it up? Because I know it's a good source. So, so he is indeed, I think, bothered by the same thing, la'alter, right away. Right? In other words, he's commenting on this line in the Shulchan Aruch that you can only do it for use right away. The davka ochem mitov b'tola, it has to be the good from the bad, and questioning whether you could do it for other people. We hope you can. He's wondering about the question of, can you take the bad from the good if it's for right away? But it says no. And remember also, it's going to be hard, it may be difficult to apply things from a long time ago because there is a difference between now and a long time ago. What's, with regard to this, what's the difference? Why would they have not been thinking of preparing it Friday night, whereas we might? What?
Like refrigeration?
Exactly, refrigeration. That's exactly right. In other words, sometimes a question seems obvious to us, but we don't find it in the classical commentaries because there was no possibility of that. And his example here is taking a fly out of a cup of wine. That probably happened a lot.
There's also the other issue that you probably won't find like an hour or times very much in these sources because people didn't use hours. The concept of 1 hour was only used maybe 200 years ago, and once trains came around. But before trains, there was no concept of an hour.
Yeah, I mean, Jews had the hour. They had a halachic hour, the idea of splitting the daytime into 12 parts, because you had to know when you could say the Shema until, which is the third hour of the day. So we do talk a lot about hours, but you're right. In the context of do this in the next hour, we don't really have that so much. You're absolutely right. People didn't think that way. La'alter, right away, before the meal. You're right. Let's see what happened here. Now. Interesting. Let's try to Kafachim. Kafachim is a Sparta commentary much later. So why do I want a later commentary? Because it might speak to these issues. Let's see when he's from, about this text. Here you go. Composed in Jerusalem, 1900 to 1940. Yosef Chaim Sofer. Okay, so now we're talking about much later, but it's an important commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Let's go to our first paragraph here. And he has a lot on it. He tends to write a lot of paragraphs. There's the Kafachan, 19 paragraphs. L'alternative. Dafka auch mit der Person. Oh, so Shamla alter mutter. Immediately you're allowed to do it for immediate consumption. It says lav dafka alter. It doesn't mean immediate, he says. It's not just immediate. Elaba'ota suda. He means in that meal. So he says, the language of the Talmud is for immediate consumption. But the Talmud does say you could separate it and leave it. When is that for? Right before a meal. You can do it for an animal also. Okay, so remember, the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles had added, he tried to clarify it a little, and he said it means for that meal. So for that meal. As long as it's for that meal, that's called right away. So he says, so here he comments on that. Rutzel says everything that's, so here he comments on the line of Rabbi Moshe. So let's everything, as long as it's for that meal, for that meal that you're preparing for, that's okay. Rutzel, this means to say, that you are doing the separating before the meal for that meal. In other words, it's during the preparation time for that meal. So we still don't really have an answer. Here's the answer. So he writes, right? Remember, he lives in the 1900s, refrigeration. So he's probably thinking, that's right, this makes it more possible, perhaps. Ice boxes probably they had in Israel in the early 1900s. Okay, so he says that the Beis Yosef writes. Now, the Beis Yosef actually is quite early. That was Rabbi Yosef Cairo, both of Shulchan Aruch in a different book. It says, She'im hu boer achar suda. Let's say that you want to do separation after a meal for the next meal. So, kol sheboer letzarech suda acheres. If you're doing it for another meal, ba'oto yom ba'atzmo, in that day itself, have la'alter. That's considered right away. Very interesting. So it sounds like he's saying, as long as it's after, right, this is what we're sort of toying with. As long as it's after your last meal, it's for an upcoming meal that day, but it's not right before the meal. As long as it is even if it's for another meal, you're doing it for the next meal on that day, that's called right away. If you're doing it during your meal, let's say you decide to do it during your Friday night meal, so that you could only do for that meal. You can't do that for Shabbos day. Then he quotes the source for an hour. It says the Mordechai source for an hour. It's actually a pretty early source, I think. So he says, the Mordechai says it has to be within an hour. And the Rambam, Maimonides, seems to agree with him. And the Shulchan Aruch here seems to agree. That's another person that seems to agree with that. Okay, then he finishes with Kachas Varav Ben Ishchai. What's the Sephardic source? Ben Ishchai in verse Bashala. Dimborer Lesuda Shematchil Ba Achar Pachot Misha Mutter. If you're preparing for a meal, it's going to begin in less than an hour, that's permitted. Even if it's going to go on for a long time. So he seems to end with the more strict opinion of an hour, but he definitely quotes an opinion that the next meal, the next upcoming meal is called right away. So let's find that source. Plus a Beis Yosef. So let's look at the Beis Yosef. It's funny because the Beis Yosef is Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Now the author of Shulchan Aruch was not so clear. He just said to eat right away, right? He just gave you, says even if it's for that day, that's not okay. But let's look at Rabbi Yosef Karo. So for that, we have to go to the Torah, the earlier version of the Shulchan Aruch, showing you more than you ever wanted to know, probably. Okay, so this is the Torah, the 14th century version of the Shulchan Aruch, written by the teacher of Rabbi Yosef Karo. Here's Rabbi Yosef Karo's commentary on that book. He later wrote the Shulchan Aruch that we call the Shulchan Aruch in the late 14, early 1500s. But this is his commentary to Rabbi Yosef. So we want Orach Chaim. Let's click on the tour. Let's go back. Now. Luckily, they're numbered the same way. The earlier version, the later version of Shulchan Aruch, the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch are numbered the same way. It's probably not in English. It's also written. It's not divided into paragraphs. So this is a slightly earlier source. If you do it with your hand to eat it right away, that's permitted. So let's click on the Beit Yosef. There's the Beit Yosef. So. Okay. Quotes the Talmud. Says you can't separate and leave it for later that day. Okay, here we go. Says, okay, says that Venirali, it appears to me, quotes somebody who says that if it's for that day, but Avalabo Yom Kloma Shabara Maniach L'Tzarach Suda Acheret Shaloto Yom, be doing it for another meal that day, that's forbidden. Venirali Dahavi Gamar. It seems to me this is what it's saying. Shemu Boer Achar Suda, if you do it after a meal, call Shaboer L'Tzarach Suda Acheret. If you're doing it for another meal, Ba'oto Yom, in that day, Ba'atzmo, Havila Alter. That means that's called right away. The next meal is called right away. Im Shubatoch Suda Bar Eno Yacho Liver. Elitzarach Ota Suda Bilbad. Chenim Bar Kodem Suda Tzarech Laochlam Batocha Suda Rishona. Im Hasha Mehem Ad Achar. Shemizomer V'Latevchayev Mordechai because of that Hatfil. Lecho Achar Beraso Shari. Lecho Achar Shah Nasa. So if the hour thing is, let's say it's not a meal. Let's say you're just doing it to eat it. So you do it. How quickly do you have to eat it? So he says within an hour. But he seems to say that if you're doing it for the next meal, even that day, that would be permitted.
And when they say day, they mean the halachic day, like.
That's a good. So I was asking myself that question. I'm not sure. That's a great question. I would think so. Because the truth is, in the situation that we're toying with, there is no other time. That is when you're preparing for that meal. Well, what do you want me to do? You want me to not go to shul? That's not called. You're not obligated to not go to shul. Whenever you're preparing for the meal, this is the time of preparing for the next meal. That's what I would think. He quotes other people who seem to disagree with him. And then he says, so he quotes other people that disagree with him. And he says, Ve'efshar, it's possible, shekol shaborer l'tzarach suda, if you're doing it for a meal, kol zeh shemiyaseh ba'osa suda, chashav la'alter. Kol zman shemiyaseh ba'osa suda, chashav la'alter. It's during the meal, obviously, it's okay. Let's say you're doing it for 3 or 4 hours in the future. It's a very hard call. So let's do this. Let's Google it, see if anybody's written about it recently. Now, it doesn't mean that every Google hit is the halacha. You have to sort of know what you're looking at. With the word halacha, you get a lot of good hits. Or halachapedia. I don't always agree with halachapedia, but it's not a bad place to be in. Because it has a lot of details. And it's usually pretty good. So here, this is also not so clear. Separating before a meal for the time it takes to prepare the meal is considered separating from immediate use. For example, if it takes half an hour to prepare the meal, one may separate only within a half hour of the meal. I mean, not separate to a few minute break from the meal. A few minute break before the meal. That's interesting. But later, let's see where they get this from. The Mishnah Berurah. It's not so clear, really. From what we read, it doesn't feel so clear. Right? Because if you're storing it, right, the language of the Talmud is storing it. So if you do it Friday night, aren't you storing it for during the day? It's not. I mean, it's true you're preparing now for the meal. It's not right before the meal. By the way, you'll notice sometimes that people come home from shul and people will say, let's say, especially for a daytime meal, basically that's where it applies. People say, what can I help with, right? If you ever come to my house, my wife will have you in the kitchen cutting vegetables for a salad. Right? That's usually what ends up happening. Why is that? So partly the salad's fresher that way. But I think also it avoids, it solves the borer issue. So, so the truth is, though, it's also an interesting question. Is not everything is really borer, right? In other words, you can make a salad without. Could you peel a cucumber? Is that borer? I think that is. It's permitted, even though you're taking the bad away from the good, because that's the way of eating it. But I don't think you could do that in advance. It would be hard to make a salad without doing borer, right?
Could you argue that the cucumber, can you eat the peel of a cucumber? Could you argue that the peel of a cucumber is also cucumber?
You could. Yeah, well, so if you leave the peel on, you have no problem. No, because what defines what ochel from patella, what defines what could be eaten from what can't be eaten is what you want.
Oh, right.
But let's say, right, I mean, you could try and take always, you're taking the good from the bad, that you have to do. Yeah.
But you couldn't like peel a carrot, or you can.
Yeah, I think it would be a problem. I think you'd have to do it before the meal. So the truth is, for most things that we're going to eat, you're not doing a lot of borer, right? What are you doing borer for? Really salad mostly. It's very hard to make a salad without doing any kind of borer. because you're gonna have to separate the good from the bad, right? You cut a pepper, you're not gonna eat the seeds. Now, obviously, one option is get ready before Shabbos. Use refrigeration to our advantage. Maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe it won't taste as good. So I think there's an understanding that that there's a bit of a lull there when you get home. That question would be,
And
question would be, let's say you can't do it Friday night. Could you do it Shabbat morning and then go to shul? I don't know, it might be problematic.
Maybe there's a market for a recipe book for gluten-free salads. I don't know if that market's been cornered yet.
It's very hard to do, I think. Yeah, you got to. I mean, you could buy things already cut up. You could buy things already washed, and yeah. So I'll check around a little bit. I think the question in our minds is, could you do a Friday night, which I'm leaning away from also. The question is there any grounds for doing it before shul on Shabbat morning? Could you make a salad before shul on Shabbat morning? I'm not sure that there's that much else that requires bower, probably. I'll check around some more. But, it seems to me that the mainstream halacha here, especially this hour idea, which seems to come up more than once, is that it's however long it usually takes to prepare this meal, that's all you can do in advance. Meaning, it seems like it could be problematic to do it. Yeah, I think salad making might have to be done when you get home. But that's why, by the way, I'll tell you it. Somebody once said to my wife, she said, I'm so glad I came to your house because it gave me the permission to have my guests help. And she said, it feels good when you ask us to help. It felt good to her. So I think there's an unsaid rule that, people will end up helping. Yeah. I'll see if there's any leniency. I'll try and check around some more for doing it before shul, but it seems like it probably has to be closer to the meal. Yeah.
For like the like 3-day sort of we had last time with Shavuot, does that apply the whole time?
What do you mean?
Meaning, so is this, and forgive me, this is a very basic question, but is this just for Shabbat or also?
Oh, does it apply on a holiday?
Yes.
Yeah, so it does. So what's permitted on a holiday, the Torah says you're allowed to do anything for food on a holiday. But rabbinically, we only do that which you could not do before Shabbat. And we assume in the process of making bread that that is only from kneading the dough and onward. In other words, winnowing, which is separating, bower, grinding, when you grind the wheat. We assume that all of that could be done before and it won't affect the quality of the taste. Whereas that's not the case in times before freezing and stuff. That's not the case with kneading. In other words, if you made a loaf of bread yesterday, it's not going to taste nearly as good as a loaf of bread today. So therefore, you are allowed to do from the malach of kneading and onwards, lisha. So, but therefore, bower is before lisha because bower is before kneading. Separating is before kneading because separating gets done. The place of separating comes from this idea of winnowing the grain. So no, so you could not do that. You can cook on Yom Tov on a holiday. It's not Shabbat, and you can knead bread. You can bake it, but you can't. You can't grind. You can't separate unless you do it in the right way. It's interesting, actually. This malach of kneading, this concept of kneading, it's not just dough. It's any dough-like substance. Whenever you take a powder, make it into something doughy. That's a problem with kneading. You know when this comes up? Have you ever made wasabi out of powder? No. So if you eat sushi and you make wasabi out of powder, basically wasabi is it's that spicy stuff. It's like this green mush, and it's you take powder or wasabi and you mix it with water, a little bit of water, and you make. It's not a cream; it's thicker than a cream. So that's probably lisha. That's probably the malach on Shabbat. You can't do that. If you want to make wasabi powder into something on Shabbat, you got to make it pretty liquidy. If you make it into something that has heft, like wasabi usually is, that's kneading, because making it into something dough-like. But you could do that on Yom Tov, because you're allowed to knead on Yom Tov. What else is it? It comes up a lot with baby cereal also. Baby cereal.
Would that apply to making like cookie dough?
What?
Could you make cookie dough? Like,
On Yom Tov, on holiday?
yeah, on Yom Tov?
Sure. Yeah, you can bake bread, bake cookies, whatever you want. Yeah. Yeah, cooking, baking, those are permitted. And that's why we take a fire from one thing to the other. We don't make a new fire, because you could have had the fire from before Shabbat, or not before Shabbat, before Yom Tov, for the holiday. Because in the old days, they didn't strike a match, they had a coal. So the coal, you can't make a new coal. You have a coal from before, you could light it, something else on it. All right, I've taken on a bit more of a detailed journey than you want to go on. But it's interesting, I would have at first glance thought that getting ready, whenever I'm getting ready for the next meal, is called getting ready. But I'm not sure that's the gist of halacha, actually.
The reason why I asked is the Beit Din asked this specific question: if you're having a friend for Shabbat lunch and she doesn't like strawberries, can you separate the strawberries out on Friday night?
They asked you that?
Yeah.
So what do you say?
I said, I don't know. I'll ask
I think
you.
there's a bit of a gotcha, because they conceded that the answer is not perfectly clear. So the point they were trying to make was ask Rabbi Schaffner, which is
Yeah. So I think the answer, it seems like so far from what we've seen, the answer is no. The answer is you'd have to do it before she's coming. Maybe within an hour, maybe whatever's called the time of getting ready for that meal. Yeah. Although I hear what Sophie was also saying, that it's after the last meal. And it also seemed a little like the Beit Yosef was saying this. I do get ready Friday night for the next meal, maybe. Could you do that? Is that called the otzer? Is that called putting it aside in storage? That's a very hard question. All right, so I have to clarify that a little bit. Oh, yeah? Oh, so take a look, Kennedy. Let us know. I don't know if I have the shop's kitchen book. I'm sure they're strict. They usually are. Oh, here it is. Here's the shop's kitchen. Here's what Art School usually does. You see how it's structured, the book? You can't see this probably, but it's like, how it is English on the top and Hebrew on the bottom. So it's not uncommon that in Art School books, they're strict on the top in the English and lenient on the bottom in Hebrew. Let's see what he says here, because they are pretty detailed. Now, just because you find an opinion that's lenient doesn't mean that's the halacha either. It says here. They also do quote good things here. Okay, for immediate use. They say here immediate is, because it's called part of the eating process, right? That's the Gemara's derech achila, the way of eating. So they say here, it restricts selection to the period routinely used for selecting an item one's about to eat. Immediate use includes the time before the meal it takes to prepare the entire meal. period immediately prior to a meal does not have a fixed time frame. Rather, it varies according to the size and nature of the meal. For a simple meal, might be very short. So on the other hand, a lavish meal might require a lot of preparation. If a particular meal takes 5 hours to prepare for, you could bin 5 hours early. So they say here that you can't prepare, take a break, and do something totally different, and then go back to preparing. That's not called immediately prior. And actually, the example they give is the example we gave. To illustrate it. They're so funny. A housewife planning to attend shul on Shabbos morning. I think it could be a man also. May not peel vegetables for the meal before leaving for shul. However, on her getting home, you could. That's what they say. Oh, he quotes the Beis Yosef that we mentioned, who brings 4 opinions in the early commentators in terms of what is immediately. Ramah. So the Beis Yosef brings 4 opinions. I think one of them was the opinion that we mentioned, that you could do it as long as for the next meal. But he says the Ramah does not bring 4 opinions. He decides on 1 opinion. And he says everything that you're separating for that meal that you're going to eat right away, that's called right away. He quotes Mishnah Berurah, who says it has to be, can't be before shul. Oh, okay. Then he quotes the Igros Moshe. The Igros Moshe is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He died in 1985, I think. I was at his funeral. Shbir Yoter desamach l'suda hainu hazman shaderech l'isha zu shemasader sa'ochlin la'suda. So he says the time it usually takes you to prepare for the meal. He says before the amount of time that it usually takes to prepare for the meal, that's called too much time. So the only option for a different position would be one of the positions that the Beit Yosef had quoted. But it doesn't seem like that's really the mainstream halacha. The question would be like, in a pinch, could you rely on that? I'm not sure. That seems to be the accepted general mainstream opinion. It seems to be is what Moshe says, and what others, the Ramah says, that however long it usually takes to get ready for the meal, that's how long. But again, I guess the question would be, could you rely on a pinch on that one opinion that's quoted in the Beit Yosef that as long as it's for the next meal? So I have to look into that. All right. If you Google around and you see anything, anybody that permits relying on that minority opinion in the Beit Yosef, let me know. I like to make things easy for Jews, but if you can't. All right.
Thanks for answering.
Have a good question. Got us. All right. Have a good week, everybody.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Rabbi.